All right. I want to welcome everyone to another edition of Reader Meet Writer. These have been sponsored by the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance since last summer when the pandemic first hit. But we have been joined, and we are very excited to be joined as a sponsor by the New Atlantic Independent Booksellers Association. They are our friends to the north of us. So we have two powerhouse independent bookselling associations and alliances coming together to support this wonderful event, Reader Meet Writer. I'm your host. My name is Wiley Cash. I am a New York Times bestselling novelist, and I'm the writer in residence at UNC Asheville. And I also have a new novel coming out this fall. I have been the host for most of these events, and we have only a few of these events left before we wrap for the season. Tonight, we are joined by Natalie Bazil to discuss her wonderful book, We Are Each Other's Harvest. But I want to make you aware of a really exciting event that we have coming up. We're going to be hosting Chris Offutt for his novel, The Killing Hills, a week from tonight, Thursday, June 17th at 7 p.m. You may know Chris Offutt as a novelist. You may know him as a memoirist. But you may not know that he was also one of the writers on TV shows like True Blood and Treme and Weeds and all of these TV shows that so many of us have enjoyed over the years. So I know that we will certainly talk to Chris about that. But as I said, tonight we are joined by Natalie, and I'm very much looking forward to it, and I hope that you are as well. If you have a question during tonight's conversation, if anything comes to your mind, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question in. It's not going to interrupt the broadcast. It's not going to interrupt the internet connection. Type the question in before you forget it, because it might fly to your mind as the conversation goes on. And when you type your question in, make sure you mention your name and the name of your favorite independent bookstore, because independent bookstores are the lifeblood of our literary community. And perhaps you are at tonight's event because a bookstore in your community invited you, put it on social media, whatever the reason. We are all here because of independent bookstores. So tonight, if you want to purchase this gorgeous book, please do it from the independent bookstore in your community instead of that obscure website named for a river. So without further ado, I want to introduce our featured author for the evening. Natalie Bazil has an MA in Afro-American Studies from UCLA, and she's a graduate of Warren Wilson College's MFA program for writers. Her novel, Queen Sugar, was named one of the San Francisco Chronicle's best books of 2014, was nominated for an NAACP Image Award, and was developed into a television show by the same name that was co-produced by Ava Duvernay and Oprah Winfrey. The show just wrapped its 5th season. Her nonfiction work has appeared in Lenny Letter, The Bitter Southerner, O Magazine, TheRumpus.net, a number of anthologies. For 2 years, she was writer in residence at St. Mary's College, where she taught a fiction workshop in the MFA program. And she is a member of the San Francisco Writers Grotto and lives in the Bay Area. And the book that we are here to discuss is We Are Each Other's Harvest. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us.
Wiley, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. So before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about the book, kind of the standard pitch to give folks who might not be as familiar with it an idea of what it's about and what's inside the pages?
Absolutely. So We Are Each Other's Harvest is really my attempt to tell the story of Black people's connection to the land from emancipation to the present with an eye towards the future. And it's an anthology. It is a collection of first-person narratives and poems and essays and articles and portraits, really trying to offer the reader a very dynamic experience of this history. I'm not a historian, so I couldn't write, a heavy history book, but this was my attempt to really assemble a chorus of voices to tell this huge and complicated, but also inspiring story of, African Americans' historic connection to the land.
And I like that you called it an anthology and specifically mentioned that, because this is an anthology in the truest sense of the word, both in terms of the literary components. We have nonfiction, we have excerpts from fiction, we have poetry, we have profiles. So it's this multifaceted genre work, but it's also a really, really diverse representation of the African American farming experience across the country. And was that really important to you to really put this patchwork of experiences and types of work together? As you said, you're not a historian, but reading this book is really an experiential deep dive into the community.
Yeah. Well, it was intentional. Part of what I was trying to say with this kind of assemblage, I was trying to bring the reader into this world and really make this story, this history, three-dimensional. And I wanted it to be broad because although the history of African Americans and agriculture and farming is anchored in the South, when we look at who's farming today and where people are farming, it is as far north as upstate New York. It is as far west as Alaska. And then it sweeps all the way down through the Midwest and through the South. And in order to articulate that experience and that history, I knew that I had to include that, kind of constellation of voices and stories, because I didn't want there to be a narrow experience or interpretation of this history.
And it certainly is not narrow. So I think that was well accomplished. Can you talk a little bit about one of my favorite pieces in the book is yours. It's one of yours, and it's the story of writing your novel. It's the story of your father leaving the place he's from, and the story of kind of this emotional, spiritual, almost like metaphysical tie you have to the place of your family's roots. And I want to ask you about Queen Sugar. The novel was a success. The TV show has been a success, and you follow that. I mean, I don't know a lot of writers who say, my novel was a big success, Oprah's producing a TV show based on it, I think I'm going to do a deep dive into farming in the African American community across the nation. And I'm wondering, what was the process of following up Queen Sugar with this book? And is this book an attempt to give a nod to all of the things you discovered when writing Queen Sugar?
Sure. So, boy, that's such a rich question. You're a writer, right? You know what it's like to spend or I'm assuming that you know what it's like to spend so much time creating a world, right? And really bringing those characters to life and flushing out the story so that the reader can inhabit the world that you've created. And that's really what I was trying to do with Queen Sugar, right? That was my attempt to kind of take the reader to a place and have them experience that and inhabit that world the same way I had inhabited it when I was doing the research and writing and spending time in Louisiana and absorbing all of that information and the atmosphere. And when I finished with Queen Sugar, as much as I really was at peace with the novel and at peace with the story I told, I knew that I had done that through the lens of fiction. And I knew that in order to write that book, people had really entrusted me with their lives, right? They had brought me into their homes and, cleared a place for me at their dinner tables and really welcomed me. And so when Tracy Sherrod, my editor at HarperCollins, approached me with the idea of doing some kind of nonfiction book, as I thought about it, I thought, I have told my interpretation of this story, of the story of Black people on the land and farming in South Louisiana. But I really felt that if I had an opportunity to do something in nonfiction, I wanted to give these people an opportunity to tell their own stories, right? And I wanted readers to hear their voices in as direct a manner as I could imagine. And so I embarked on this project to, try to put my arms around this big subject, but I really wanted that chorus of voices. I wanted the reader to be able to open it up and hear from the Nelsons in Sondheimer, Louisiana, and hear from Melanie Edwards up in Alaska. I wanted to give these farmers a chance to tell their own stories, which they really had not had a chance to.
And I think it's so interesting that in researching Queen Sugar, you found yourself with a parent from your kid's school going back to like her land in Louisiana, where you meet other people and they are, kind of providing this gateway into your family's connection to the land, right? And then you go out with this book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, and you give other people the opportunity, people like me, to have a gateway into the experience of these people on the land through these gorgeous profiles of these people, as you mentioned, that really cover the country, from Alaska to Southwest Louisiana. And speaking of covering the country and trying to cover big things, this is a huge question, and I've asked a couple of long questions, so forgive me.
That's okay. We're good.
Maybe not a long question, but a big question.
Okay.
One thing that's really interesting to me, and that I think would be interesting to the folks watching and the folks who will watch this later, is the history of African American farmers from Africa to enslavement to sharecropping to the Great Migration to the generation now that's known in the book referred to as the returning generation. Can you talk about the returning generation with all of that history stacked on its back?
Sure. So the returning generation is a description that really Leah Penniman, one of the two women who's on the cover of the book, I think Leah coined that to describe this new generation of people of color, Black people, Indigenous farmers, Native American farmers, Latinx farmers, Asian farmers, who are returning to the land. They are returning to agriculture. These are, young people, younger than I am, in their 20s and 30s and, maybe even early 40s, who who are telling a different story about what it means to be connected to the soil. And they have oftentimes, they've graduated from college, they have had professional careers, but they understand the value of legacy, and they understand, they see this moment as an opportunity to do a couple of things. First of all, connect with the past, right? And often they farm in ways that call on traditional farming practices that really have roots in Africa, right? Or in Native American farming practices. But they also are approaching this work really through the lens of activism and social justice. And they see farming and this return to the land as a way to address all of these social concerns about food sovereignty and food justice and health and wealth and the income gap and wealth disparities, reparations. I mean, the land comes to mean so much, right? And it's these young people, this new generation, who are really leading the way. And I just find their work so inspiring because they have such vision and passion, and they just bring a real certainty and determination to this work that, I think is going to really lead us forward, and people are inspired by it.
When I think about things like the returning generation, I think about the generation of writers before this generation I guess, the generation before mine. And we mentioned when we were hanging out in the green room, eating off the deli tray and the green M&Ms before we began, we were talking about Ernest Gaines. And this is a guy who grew up on a plantation in Southwest Louisiana on land where his ancestors had been slaves and sharecroppers, leaves because he can't get an education. There's no schools for Black children in middle school. And he goes out to the Bay Area, which you know well. Mm-hmm. And then he comes back as a young man to have this regenerating experience to write about Southwest Louisiana. And then as soon as he is able, he goes back and he buys a piece of the land that he was born on and has the old church moved from the quarters into his backyard. And we know Alex Haley bought a plantation in Tennessee. Alice Randall wrote the novel The Wind Done Gone in a response to Gone with the Wind. And I think that we're familiar with these physical reclamations of space. We're familiar with these literary reclamations of tradition, or even in terms of cinema, these reclamations of, I'm thinking about like Spike Lee's Bamboozled or something like that. But the reclaiming of foodways and farming practices, that is something, I don't want to ask where did that come from, because obviously that's always been happening, but how is that different? How is this newer generation, how has it fallen on them to be the stewards of this reclamation, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that has happened because, you know, we all are facing a climate crisis, right? And I think what these young people recognize is that the old ways of doing things actually were the better ways. So for example, if you go up to Soul Fire Farm, you will see their farm, they will have 3 different crops in the same row, right? They'll have corn, squash, and I'm blanking on the other one, but they will grow 3 crops in the same row. Well, why, right? Well, these were practices that our ancestors were practicing back on the African continent. These are indigenous Native Americans were farming this way. And it's not just about conserving space, but these were practices that preserved the soil, for example, regenerated the soil. So there's real wisdom there. Mm-hmm. And I think so often when we think about what's happening with big agriculture today, right? Part of the challenge there is the land has been decimated. It has contributed to climate change. I mean, there are just all of these factors that are really endangering the planet, all for the benefit of, you know, mass production, when these ways, these smaller, quieter, simpler ways are actually the things that are going to help us preserve this planet. And Leah and lots of other young people recognize this, right? So when you hear words like regenerative agriculture today, right, that's all about soil preservation and carbon sequestration and, you know, putting carbon back in the soil. These are old ways that are just being rediscovered and rebranded, and the returning generation recognizes this. So it's tapping back into the past, but with an eye towards the future.
And it's so interesting how you described that generation a few moments ago. You said, you know, many of them are highly educated, undergraduate degrees, graduate degrees, all of this specialized training. And they are in a moment where they are both recognizing the possibility of food shortages, environmental destruction and degradation, and they're looking ahead and saying, the only way to solve this is to look back. Yeah. And so this is a generation that is bearing so much responsibility, but they're doing it kind of on the footing of all the generations that have come before them. I think it's just it's an enormous responsibility that we've given these young people, but who else but them is going to do it?
Exactly. And, you know, they're also thinking about community, right? They're thinking about when you when you talk to these folks, they are really thinking about how can we all live better lives? How can we work together to move forward? How can we address some of these ills that are really driving us all apart, right? And use these farms, use the land as a way of healing, as a way of bringing people together for a common cause. How can we rethink our ideas about community and taking care of each other? All of that is part of what's on their minds, you know, because they've seen that in so many ways, so much of so many systems and practices aren't working, and they're looking for equity, they're looking for sovereignty. I just am so, I'm always so inspired by them, you know. They just are wonderful.
And what you just said, you know, community, taking care of each other, bringing people together, it is so positive and so forward looking and so so aware. But as Dr. Annalita Hope Hasberg says in her opening and part of her introduction, she says, throughout the course of African Americans on this continent, resistance has been constant.
Yes.
And can you talk about agriculture, farming, foodways from way back to right now as an act of resistance?
Absolutely. So I think about so many of the farmers, especially the older farmers who I interviewed. These were often, you know, people in their 70s or 80s or, you know, even 90s, right? Who tell stories, who really shared memories with me of their forefathers telling them, own land, because if you own land, nobody can take that away from you. Nobody can, well, that was the idea, right? Nobody can drive you off this land if you own it. It was an act of resistance because these were land ownership, and land stewardship is an act of resistance, right? If you can feed yourself, that means you don't have to depend on anybody else. If you can grow your own crops and feed your family, that means that you're not beholden in the same way that you would be if you're dependent upon someone else. And when I think about, you know, the history of African Americans and this desire to own land, I think about like the story of Garrison Frazier, the minister who during Sherman's march, you know, to the sea, when he was going through Atlanta, he dispatched his Secretary of War, Stanton, to meet with 20 African American ministers who were representing all of these newly emancipated people. And when Stanton asked the group, what can the United States do for you? How can we be of assistance? Garrison Frazier said, you can give us land, because even as newly emancipated people, right, who had been enslaved, they recognized the value of having a little patch of land that they could call their own, that nobody could take away. They could protect their families, they could feed themselves, they could work the land, they could be independent and prosper. And so when we think about, you know, this whole idea of farming and land and what it means, it's so interwoven into all of our, you know, the American narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Black people understood that too. And then you have this whole long history of disenfranchisement that has, you know, undercut that. But there was a deep understanding from the very beginning about what that connection to the land really meant.
And that was going to be my next question. And you know, you mentioned that having land meant nobody could take it away from you. And I'm coming to you from Wilmington, North Carolina, which is the home of the 1898 race massacre, the only successful coup in American history, where African American land, property, businesses were just taken overnight. And we've spent the past couple of months talking about Tulsa and what that meant. And those are, 1898 in Wilmington was covered up. People in the African American community obviously never forgot it, but it was the kind of thing that wasn't taught in school. It wasn't talked about in the white community. It was deemed a race riot, not a race massacre, a race riot. But these are still big public things that we can all look at and say, there is the mark on the calendar when this thing happened. But as Pete Daniels' essay in the book points out, these upheavals, these difficulties, these troublings of what it means to be an African American landowner in America are not always enormous public upheavals. Sometimes they're legal yet insidious attempts to disenfranchise, as you said. Can you talk about USDA? Can you talk about big agriculture and the effect on small African American farms or even big African American farms?
Yeah, for sure. So we all know that the USDA is one of the agencies, right, that's under the umbrella of the U.S. government. It was started to help American farmers. That is its purpose, to dispense information in the form of, the newest innovations, the newest technological developments, growing practices. This is what this agency, this government agency, is designed to do. Going back over 100 years, unfortunately, when it came to African American farmers, when it came to Black farmers, this same governmental agency that was tasked with supporting and uplifting farmers really was the biggest source of disenfranchisement for Black farmers. Why is that? Because the USDA also is tasked with loaning money to farmers, right? So that they can buy their seeds, so that they can buy their equipment. And because those federal funds, when they trickle down to the local rural communities all across the South or the Midwest or whatever, because the local USDA agents in these rural communities were really like kings of the kingdom, right? And they took these federal funds and, without much oversight from the top down, really were allowed to use those federal funds almost like their own personal funds. And these were the people who were deciding who got the loans. So when the African American farmers were coming to their local, in their little towns, right, or hamlets, when they would go to the USDA office and apply for a loan, oftentimes the loan agents and the USDA agents would tear up their applications, or they would delay their loans, or they would deny their loans. Well, what does that mean? It means if I'm a farmer and it is the end of the growing season and I'm looking ahead to the next growing season, I need to have enough money to buy my equipment, buy my fertilizer, buy my seeds early enough so that I can be ready to plant. But if I don't get that loan on time because the application has been torn up or the loan has been delayed or denied, that automatically starts to put me behind in terms of when I'm able to plant and grow and continue to be independent. And if you think about, this is what happened in all of these communities all across the South, where Black farmers were trying to just do what they needed to do. But you had these local agents who were deploying all of these discriminatory practices to make sure that Black farmers didn't succeed. This happened generation after generation after generation. And so as Black farmers fall behind because they can't plant, because they haven't, gotten their money on time, then these same government agencies would go back to these Black farmers when they couldn't perform on their loans, and they would seize their property. They would seize the farm. They would seize the house, the car, all of these personal assets. And in Pete Daniels' essay, he lays out this long history of the USDA's deliberate and intentional, these practices that disenfranchise Black people generation after generation after generation, and led to that famous class action lawsuit, Pigford versus Glickman, where the USDA finally acknowledged, yes, we have been doing this for the last 100 years. And now the new administration is trying to address that once again. But it's a long history.
Sure, and that was going to be my next question. There's a part in the book, and I can't remember where it is, but you write, it's one thing to talk about these things. It's and to recognize these things. It's another thing to solve these things,
Yes.
to come up with solutions to solving them. You mentioned the current administration. Do you have hope? Do you have faith in the agricultural secretary who's been there before?
Yeah.
Do you have faith in the vision of the new administration? And if there is one thing, I'm not asking you to solve all the problems tonight in the little bit of time we have left, but if there is one thing that you would like to see that would just make you feel a little bit better if you saw the people in this book 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, or saw their children down the road, what would it be?
So I am cautiously optimistic. I think that, really for the first time, Wiley, in our history, the story of Black farmers seems to have finally seeped into the public consciousness, right? Even 18 months ago, people weren't really talking about this the way they are now. And there is I don't want to call it a groundswell, maybe that's a little too optimistic, but there is some intentional legislation and policies that are being put in place to address this long history. And so I am cautiously optimistic. We've been here before. I was just listening to a podcast this morning with a farmer, an older farmer in Virginia, Mr. Wright, who says, this is the third time Black farmers have been promised, an opportunity, and it hasn't borne fruit. So I think that for the first time, there is enough attention. We'll see what, Tom Vilsack does, the Secretary of Agriculture. He has said that he is committed to addressing these ills and, offering debt relief and land and education, lots of support. So I'm hopeful, but I think I'm most hopeful when I look at the young people who are moving forward, regardless, they are, they're really not waiting. They're not waiting, they're doing. And that, I think, gives me the most hope.
I want to remind folks that if you have a question for Natalie tonight, go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question in there. Mention your name and the name of your home independent bookstore. And in the time that we have left, I will make sure that your question is asked. You mentioned the stories of all these farmers. Is there one particular family or community or individual that you can tell us about that you encountered while writing this book, or even maybe going out on the road as much as you've been able to in support of this book?
Yeah. Every single farming family I met, I just loved. But if I had to pick one that I think really represents, the long arc of history, I would have to probably pick the Bluefords. The Nelsons, the Bluefords also. So the Nelsons are a fourth and fifth Black farming family in Sondheimer, Louisiana, up in North Louisiana, kind of right tucked in there in the north, I guess that'd be the northeast corner. And what I loved about this family, it's Mr. Nelson and his 4 adult sons. Adrian, the youngest when I met them, was 28. The oldest one, Willie Nelson Jr. was probably in his early 40s. And these young men were they had a vision for what they're doing. They are not letting the obstacles stop them. And I should backtrack one step and say, the first thing Mr. Nelson shared with me when I went to visit them, he told me the story of his grandfather or great grandfather, who when he was emancipated, labored and toiled for years to acquire a little bit of land in Mississippi, and worked and worked and worked to buy this land. And literally the day that he was making his final loan payment, the white landowner who he was going to buy this land from said to him, "I'm not selling you this land," right? And this gentleman had no choice but to walk away after all of these years of working towards this goal. 2 generations later, or 3 generations later, we have this new generation of young men who are hardworking. They work together, they are ambitious. They are currently farming. They are more traditional farmers. So they grow, commodity crops, soybeans and cotton. And they don't own all the land that they farm. They lease some of the land, including prison land at Parchment Farm. But they are farming about 3,000 acres, I believe. And their vision is they're just so ambitious, and they're organized, and they're just not letting anything stop them. And they're just lovely, lovely people. And what killed me was they were telling me that the farm that their land that they're farming, actually they call themselves dry farmers, because their land isn't even irrigated the way some of their white counterparts' land is farmed. So they're not even on the best land, right? And they're still able to persevere, and they're still able to thrive. And I just was so inspired by their story and their warmth. I just loved them, and they're just lovely. They're just lovely people. So that's one of the stories.
Well, we've got one question that's come in. Just I want to ask you before we wrap. This is such a as you said, it's an anthology in the truest sense of the word, and there is so much history here. There is so much, so many intimate portrayals of families like the one you just mentioned. But we also have these poems from many of them incredibly well-known writers like Yusef Komunyakaa, Joy Harjo, Leonard Moore from here in North Carolina. How did you find these pieces? Did you already know them? Did you cast about for writers from rural places with farming backgrounds?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to include poetry in the book because, sometimes a poem can say something, can convey an emotion, can convey an experience in a way that is so elegant and eloquent and concise and emotional. And I don't write poetry, but I love to read poetry and just find great comfort in it. And for whatever reason, I felt like there needed to be poetry in this anthology. It's because when I was thinking about this book, I wanted it to be dynamic, and I wanted it to be surprising, and I wanted it to be, kind of multifaceted. And so poetry is part of that for me. When I think about art and what I'm inspired by that. And I wanted the reader to have that experience. So when it came to finding the poems for the book, it was one of the many great pleasures to really just kind of explore and look around. And, Yusef Komunyakaa is a poet who I have a tremendous amount of, admiration for. A lot of his poems when he talks about his Southern experience, remind me of stories that my dad told about his Southern boyhood. So I knew I wanted to have his poems in the book, but I also wanted to have poems that, you know, were glancing at this idea of land. They're not all land poems, right?
Mhm.
They are often poems that talk about food. I think of Lucille Clifton's poem, Cutting Greens, right? I think about Ross Gay's poem about, you know, gathering figs from someone's back tree. I think of Robin Cost Lewis's poem, Frame, that is part of her masterwork, Voyage of the Sable Venus, where that's just what I have in the book is just a tiny excerpt. It's just a few stanzas where she talks about, the narrator talks about being a kid in Compton, Los Angeles. But because there are migrants from the South and people are, you know, have little backyard farms, and she's this kid who's running through, you know, this community.
Mhm.
I wanted there to be that kind of resonance, you know, in the book, so that we were talking about farming, but we were also talking about something bigger than that, you know, and poetry was a way to get at that.
Well, I want to close it out tonight with a question we've got about urban farming, since you just mentioned that last bit about
Sure.
the farm or the rural life of sorts in Compton. Krista writes in, she says, "My name is Krista. I own Farmer John Philly Agriculture. On your journeys of farm visits, have you encountered many true urban farms within major metros that are Black owned? And do you see the reintroduction of farming into the lifestyle of city dwellers as a means toward healing food insecurity within major metros? Thank you for being amazing. I would love to host you in Philadelphia."
Well, thank you, first of all. And absolutely, you know, just yesterday, I was talking to an amazing guy named Tony Hillary, who he doesn't own this farm, but he founded this farm in Harlem called Harlem Grown. His story is so inspiring. You know how he's working with kids at six schools in Harlem, bringing kids into this farm, and he has like, I think 19 different city lots all around in Harlem where they are growing food. He is literally, he said to me yesterday, "I'm growing food, but I'm actually growing lives," right? And I think about Ron Finley in Los Angeles and the Gangster Gardener, right? And the work that he is doing to transform his community. I think of so many farmers who are, you know, in urban settings who are using the land to transform their communities, to they're doing the same thing that the rural farmers are doing, right? And it is just as inspiring, just as inspiring.
Well, thank you, Natalie. I think this whole evening has been very inspiring. So thank you so much for joining us. And
My pleasure.
thank you to all of you out there. If you want to pick up this wonderful book, please do it from the independent bookstore in your community and support independent bookstores. And please join us next week when we're with Chris Offutt to discuss his new novel, The Killing Hills. Until then, good night, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. Natalie, thank you so much for being with us. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure, Wiley. Thanks for a great conversation.
Good night, everybody.
Night.